the 2030 agenda is in danger, is in deep trouble. And this is obviously based on the data available to us 8 years into the implementation. If we can go to the next slide, please. The latest reports at the international level show a rather dire picture, I would say, of where we are as a global community, or where we stand in respect to the implementation of the SDGs. The current situation that we have, as you can see it in this graphic, show that based on the progress since 2015, since when the agenda was adopted, in 2016, where it was when it was started to be implemented, the goals were none of the goals is on track to be achieved by 2030. So after 8 years, if we continue the way that we're doing, by 2030, we're not going to achieve any of the goals at the global level. This is, of course, very different in different countries and regions, but at the global level, we're just, as a global community, we're not on track based on the data. And the data that you're seeing on the screen, especially on the right side, is the one collected by the United Nations and all the custodian agencies for the different targets under the SDGs. And the data is showing us that most of the SDGs are moderate or severely off track. And as you can see on the gray lines, this is also data that we don't even have. So for all the SDGs, it's not that we can measure 100% of the progress that we have made. We have increasing data gaps on the SDGs. And this mega trend that we're having since 2015 is obviously reinforced by diverse crises across the globe, which are stalling or even reversing positive trends that the community achieved in the early years of the implementation. One example is the reduction of poverty, which was going on a good positive trend, and since the pandemic is reversing its trend. But what we have noticed as well is that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the efforts were not enough. So the data was showing us that even before the COVID-19 impacts hit the different countries in different ways, we were not achieving the SDGs fast enough to be able to make it by the deadline of 2030. And since then, we have had more crises as well. For example, the war in Ukraine that affects different countries and different regions in different ways. So what we can see now on the left side of the graph is that the SDG progress globally has stalled. So if you see the SDGs, the red ones show that there is major challenges for it to be achieved by 2030. And the little arrows show you the trend of where the SDG is moving towards the 2030 deadline. And as we can see, none of them, or most of them, is stagnating at the global level. Like I said, this obviously depends a lot on the country you're looking into and the realities of the regions. The data shows that these disruptions caused by ravaging climate change, for example, or the socioeconomic impacts of COVID aggravated the fiscal spaces in low-income countries and also lower middle-income countries, which is leading to the reversal in progress on several goals and indicators. The UN is telling us this year, and this is very, very fresh out of the oven data, which came out in July this year, that of the 140 targets that we can assess, only about 15% are on track to be achieved by 2030. And we're not talking about 15 of the SDGs. We're talking about 15% of the targets, which is even a more worrying picture. And about half of them show moderate or severe change from the desired trajectory, and more than 30% experience no progress or even worse, regression below the 2015 baseline. So in some SDGs, in some topics, we're actually going in a worse direction than we were before the SDGs were adopted, which is definitely a very worrying picture. If we look at the example on the left, we can see that there are some SDGs that are doing worse than others. For example, we have the goal on zero hunger, on health, as well as sustainable cities. That might be a bit interesting also for the participants today. the biodiversity goals, both on land and underwater, and also the peace and justice SDG, the SDG 16, is showing massive reverse. And based on this picture, the Secretary General formulated very clearly this year at the high-level political forum in July in New York, where he says that the promise of the 2030 agenda is in peril. But what does that even mean? Like the promise is in peril. What does these numbers actually mean? So if we can go to the next slide, I can give you just very few examples of what that actually means, because we're talking about very clear realities. And if this trend continues, it means that almost 600 million people are going to still be living in extreme poverty by 2030. And only 1/3 of countries will meet their poverty reduction goals and targets that they set themselves to. It also means that at the moment we are back at hunger levels not seen since 2005. This is where the Millennium Development Goals were still in place. And food prices remain higher in more countries than before the COVID pandemic. It also means that the things which are going, it will take almost 300 years to close the gender gap in legal protection and remove discriminatory laws, which is obviously an unacceptable reality. But it also means, and now to make a connection, for example, to the SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities, it also means that the number of people living in slums could triple in the next 30 years if trends continues, also due to the lack of affordable housing. So this is just a snapshot of what it actually means that we are not on track. And you can go on this trend for each SDG and paint a worrying picture of where we are right now. If we can go to the next slide, we can talk a bit about the major challenges that we have at the global level. And one of them is the access to data. I mentioned that before. Now, for all the SDGs, we have data, which I'm talking about reliable, timely, and disaggregated data. In many SDGs, we don't know where we're at, or we have very delayed data, which means making informed policy decisions are more complicated, as well as we have in certain areas, certain SDGs and certain regions, for example, we have no idea who is being left behind, which means the promise of the 2030 agenda more complicated to be achieved. This is the problem at the UN level as well. So if you look at the reports that they publish, the baseline they use is not always the same. So not SDG 1 through 17, all of them has data for 2023. Some of them will have data for 2018, some of them 2021. So it's very difficult to make comparisons as well, as we don't have access to reliable and timely data. Another massive issue that we have at the moment for the implementation of the SDGs is the huge finance gap that we have for SDG implementation. So the OECD is estimating, I think the estimates from still this year, latest last year, that the financing gap, that means the amount of money that should be invested globally every year to achieve the 2030 agenda at the global level. In 2015, it was 2.5 trillion US dollars. To this day, that gap has widened to be about 4.2 trillion. And that increase is only in the last 3 years alone. So that shows the impacts of the COVID pandemic had huge repercussions on the way we're investing money as well. Due to the pandemic, a lot of countries shifted their investments toward crisis management, for example, and also increased debt. And the recovery in many regions implied in many countries, and this was also seen, for example, in Europe, the deviation from investment into renewable energies towards CO2 intensive industries to boost the economy and slow down the breakdown of the economies at national levels. So these crises are obviously very multidimensional. They affect very different aspects of the SDGs, very different, a lot of SDGs at the same time. And for example, the pandemic, which is still very much felt in many countries. I think in Europe, maybe in Germany, sometimes we forget that the pandemic happened because now we have moved towards different topics, but this is a reality in many, many countries at the moment. show that there is an urgency to expand fiscal capacities in countries and also private investment. There is at the moment, we have a debt crisis in many regions that threaten the ability of these countries to invest in SDG transformation, which makes obviously keeping the promise by 2030 even more complicated and more difficult. And this is one of the most important topics at the moment at the international level. So if you look at all the discussions at the UN level, which is where I'm mostly involved, you see that both the UN and a big chunk of the member states are calling for debt relief and a so-called SDG stimulus, which was a proposal by the Secretary General to mobilize funding of $500 billion a year to move forward the implementation of the Agenda 2030. And these discussions are being had in almost all UN fora at the moment. During this year's high-level political forum, which is the central forum for the review of the Agenda 2030, the global community conducts a review of selected SDGs. And this year, for example, SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities was one of the ones that was reviewed. I can tell you a little bit about the discussions about that one specifically, just to make an example of the discussions had in New York. Obviously, I'm not an expert in the topic of cities, but I would like to maybe report from what was discussed there. And I'm pretty sure later on you will be able to put the discussions more on the ground on your work. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So some of the key areas that were identified during the review at this year's high-level political forum were, for example, the access to affordable housing as one of the biggest issues for SDG 11, the impact of climate change on cities, the growing poverty numbers in urban areas, as well as the necessity for urban development, which is compatible with the climate goals, improved public infrastructure, for example, transportation and sustainable waste management. Those were key areas that the policymakers were discussing at this year's HLPF in New York. And it is important to mention more generally that no matter which SDG people discuss about, the topic of localization of global agendas, in this case, the 2030 agenda, has taken the international stage for a while now. So more and more policymakers are aware of the role of local actors for the implementation of the SDGs and the necessary changes that this requires, for example, in governance structures within countries. And this is also obviously a topic that local authorities themselves have brought to the international discussions as well to portray how important this is. I don't know if you recall, I think it was the former UN Secretary General who also said that the fight for the climate change is going to be defined in cities. So it's to show a bit of the role, the importance of the role of cities for the implementation of the whole of SDGs. Also, if we see the demographics showing us that more people are going to be living in cities if they're not already. And science is also on the side of localization of the SDGs, which is shown by the reports that I have been showing you before, including the so-called Global Sustainable Development Report, short GSDR, that is going to be launched in September, actually in 2 weeks now, in the SDG Summit in New York. The GSDR is kind of like the assessment of assessments for the 2030 agenda and is published every 4 years. If we can go to the next slide, maybe another interesting hint for you now looking a bit more on the involvement of Germany was the official German side event that was held this year on the HLPF, which focused on the interlinkages between cities and access to clean water, as well as the reduction of inequalities in cities. And also for, obviously, I would like to mention the voluntary local reviews, which are, in case are not known by you, and maybe you guys are already experts on the topics, but these are the local versions of the voluntary national reviews, which are state-led analysis and accountability reports on the implementations of the SDGs at home. And cities have started since 2016 to present their own local reports to showcase their efforts on localizing the SDGs, as well as highlighting the challenges that they face. This is not only concerning SDG 11, they do it for all the SDGs within their constituency. And this allows a more holistic view on the reality of cities. So maybe in your city where you live, they have already presented one, or they're working on one, or maybe one of you is even working with a partner to create one. And just to finish, one last thing, I mentioned before, the upcoming SDG Summit on the 18th of September, which is now in 11 days, happening in New York. It's at the level of heads of states and government. It happens every 4 years. And it has a political declaration as an outcome document. The declaration is being negotiated right now, and is expected to be adopted on the 18th of September and later on in the General Assembly. And some examples of the content of the text is the renewed commitment to accelerated action, and more in connection to the local level is the commitment to localizing the SDGs by enhancing financial and technical assistance to plan and implement sustainable urbanization programs. And these are all important political signals at the highest political level, which can be then translated at the local level, as well as serve as a benchmark for accountability for national institutions. So it's very important that these topics are also included in the outcome document of the SDG Summit happening now in the midway point of the implementation. Yeah, I know that was a lot of numbers, very fast. That was actually all I wanted to share with you today. At the next slide, you have some relevant references, some documents that you can look into. We can share those documents afterwards. So you can also access the data if you're interested in specific SDGs. The report by the United Nations has extended reports for each SDG, which all the data is available. So this can also be helpful for your work. And I hope this gives you a bit of a overall picture of where we are on the SDGs, and maybe embed the conversations from yesterday and the ones you're about to have today in the broader scheme of things. Thank you.